Imagine you live in a tight-knit rural community where, routine errands suddenly become life or death gambles. You were in eastern Idaho, specifically the region encompassing the towns of Blackfoot and Idaho Falls.
Right.
The year is 1987. It's late winter, spanning those really freezing, snow-covered weeks between February 28th and March 21st. The local convenience stores in this area, the brightly lit places you've visited 1,000 times to grab a cup of coffee on your way to work or rent a video on a Friday night, they suddenly transform into hunting grounds.
Yeah, it's terrifying.
It is. You don't know who is out there in the dark, but people are disappearing from their shifts. And, they're being found in the most brutalized conditions imaginable.
Yeah.
So to understand how a community's fundamental illusion of safety just gets shattered overnight, we have to look at the architectural blueprint of a spree killer. We're looking at a massive forensic and criminological dossier today for this deep dive. One that details the exact intersection of severe childhood developmental trauma, substance-induced psychosis, and, predatory escalation. We are examining the comprehensive timeline of the Paul Ezra Rhoades spree.
And the sources we're analyzing today, they detail his precise modus operandi, the victimology, and the really intricate forensic matrix that law enforcement had to construct to finally trap him. This is a clinical look at how a violent offender evolves, step by excruciating step.
Right, and the question that anchors this entire analysis is how a localized burglar, someone primarily focused on covert property crimes, transforms into a calculated sadistic spree killer in just a matter of weeks.
Yeah, that's the core mystery.
So to understand the mechanics of that escalation, we really have to look at the etiology of the offender. We have to start with the making of Paul Ezra Rhoades and the immense physical and psychological trauma that defined his early development.
We rarely see offenders of this magnitude just, emerge in a vacuum. And Rhoades is a textbook example of compounded trauma. So he was born on January 18th, 1957, in Idaho Falls. He was the first of 4 children to Augustus and Pauline Rhoades.
Okay.
But his trajectory was almost immediately derailed by this catastrophic medical event. In 1961, when he was just 4 years old, he contracted polio.
Which is an absolute nightmare scenario,
Yeah.
especially in an era where the vaccine was only just starting to roll out widely.
Yeah.
But what does the polio virus actually do to a child's body in a severe case like this?
Well, the virus typically enters through the mouth and multiplies in the intestine, but in a very small percentage of critical cases, it actually invades the central nervous system.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it directly attacks and destroys the motor neurons in the spinal cord, the nerves that are responsible for telling muscles to move.
Yeah.
So when those neurons are destroyed, the corresponding muscles become paralyzed and eventually they atrophy. For Rhoades, the virus severely and permanently damaged one of his legs.
And the treatment for pediatric polio in the early 1960s wasn't just, simple physical therapy. It involved incredibly invasive, brutal interventions.
Right. It required a grueling, endless sequence of corrective surgeries. We're talking about bone fusions, tendon transfers, and these long, long periods of being immobilized in heavy plaster casts.
Just awful for a kid.
Oh, the isolation of that experience is profound. Long-term pediatric hospitalization back then was incredibly restrictive. There were very limited visiting hours for parents. You have a 4-year-old child separated from his family, enduring severe physical pain, and confined to a hospital bed while, his peers are outside developing normal social and motor skills.
There's a specific incident detailed in the medical chronology that seems to perfectly encapsulate the physical horror he was enduring. It involves one of those plaster casts.
Yes. So during his recovery, a cast had been left on his leg for an extended period, and the tissue beneath it actually began to necrotize. His parents only discovered the severity of the situation because the cast began to emit this foul, putrid odor. The limb had literally developed gangrene beneath the plaster.
It's difficult to even fathom the psychological impact of that.
Yeah.
The child is sitting there, unable to move, while his own tissue is literally dying and rotting attached to his body.
Medical intervention did save the leg from amputation, thankfully, but the physical and psychological scars were permanent. He was left with this pronounced, heavy limp that would define his physical presence for the rest of his life.
Which brings us to the sociological impact. In the conservative, rural environment of 1960s Idaho, that kind of severe physical difference made him a massive target for his peers.
Absolutely. The criminological profile notes he faced intense discrimination and relentless bullying. He was categorized by his peers entirely due to his physical otherness, right?
Right.
And when a child is mocked and ostracized for a physical deformity they can't control, it often forces an early withdrawal from normal social structures. They retreat inward, and resentment begins to calcify.
And that societal rejection compounds catastrophically with his domestic reality. I mean, if the outside world was hostile, the environment inside the Rhoades household offered absolutely no safe harbor.
Not at all. His father, Augustus, was an assertive, highly volatile alcoholic. The Rhoades home was a known, frequent problem area for local law enforcement. Police interventions for domestic battery were just a regular occurrence.
So the foundational years of Paul Ezra Rhoades are defined by profound physical pain, public humiliation, and a home life completely destabilized by violence, poverty, and unpredictable rage.
Exactly. And how does a developing brain cope with that specific matrix of trauma? We see the coping mechanisms emerge incredibly early in the timeline. By the age of 10, he's already consuming alcohol.
Wow, 10 years old.
Yeah, directly mirroring his father's destructive self-medicating behaviors. And the academic environment offered no structure either. He struggled immensely and completely dropped out of the education system by the ninth grade.
So he just had nothing.
Right. He became entirely untethered from the primary stabilizing forces of society. No school structure, no safe family environment, and zero peer acceptance.
And his introduction to the workforce only brought more trauma. The records show that by 16, he was working in the industrial sector, specifically at a food packing plant, where he suffered yet another gruesome physical injury.
In a workplace accident, his fingertips were severed. It's just a compounding sequence of bodily destruction. Eventually, he transitioned into the family business, working alongside his father, uncle, and brother doing drywall and sheetrock construction. But even with the trade, his economic instability remained severe, and this was largely due to the aggressive escalation of his chemical dependency.
The timeline notes that in his late 20s, his substance abuse takes a massive dark turn. He shifts from alcohol dependency to injecting what was known locally as crank-like, a highly potent, illicitly manufactured form of methamphetamine.
Yes, and this addiction became the primary driver for a series of residential burglaries he began committing across Idaho and down the Wasatch Front in Utah. He was breaking into homes specifically to fund the methamphetamine habit.
But there's a massive contradiction in his timeline here that we need to address. The clinical notes mention that despite the heavy meth use, the burglaries, and the simmering rage from his trauma, he maintained this bizarre camouflage in his personal life.
He did.
He frequently babysat his young nieces and nephews. He could blend into the family structure, playing the role of the, helpful, benign uncle.
This is where we really need to introduce the criminological concept of the pharmacological bridge.
Okay, let's get into that.
So Rhoades harbored these deep-seated violent resentments stemming from his lifelong marginalization and trauma. But those urges were contained to some degree by whatever fragile psychological barriers he had constructed. The intravenous methamphetamine acted as a chemical bridge.
Let's define the mechanics of that bridge for a second. What is the meth actually doing to his brain that turns latent anger into physical violence?
Chronic high-dose methamphetamine abuse severely disrupts the prefrontal cortex. That's the area of the brain responsible for impulse control, judgment, and the regulation of behavior.
Right.
It strips away a person's inhibitions while simultaneously flooding the brain with dopamine. This creates artificial feelings of extreme power, grandiosity, and paranoia. The drug didn't create his rage, the trauma did that, but the meth dismantled the psychological dam, keeping that rage in check.
It fueled violent fantasies that had likely been, gestating in the dark for years. It gave him the chemical courage to act them out.
Precisely. Which brings us to the transitional phase, detailed in the source material. The months right before the 1987 spree. We see a clear behavioral shift from covert property crimes, sneaking into empty houses, for cash to overt predatory stalking. This is the voyeur phase.
The behavioral profile shows he developed a deep, focused fixation on female service workers. Specifically, he targeted young women working at convenience stores in the Blackfoot and Idaho Falls areas.
Yeah.
And if you're listening to this and wondering how someone just loiters outside a store for hours without the police being called, you have to remember the context of 1987 rural Idaho. We didn't have cell phones. There was no widespread, high-definition CCTV monitoring every parking lot.
Exactly. It was a different world. And the physical description of Rhoades at this time is chilling in its specificity. He's described as a large, pear-shaped man with long, unkempt hair, walking with that heavy, dragging limp from his childhood polio.
Right.
He would spend hours standing in the freezing cold outside these stores, just watching the women work through the large glass windows.
There's one documented incident that perfectly illustrates this escalation. A witness observed him pulling a hood tightly around his face to conceal his features, while peering intently at a female clerk right as the store was closing for the night.
In behavioral analysis, that specific action is a massive red flag. It's a classic indicator that an offender has entered the predatory phase. He's no longer just creeping around. He is actively rehearsing. He's conducting dry runs.
So he's practicing.
Yeah. This voyeurism serves a dual purpose. It desensitizes the offender to the adrenaline of the actual abduction, and it allows them to meticulously select targets with the highest vulnerability.
But looking at the geography and the methodology, why convenience stores? If the ultimate goal is abduction and violence, why not target someone in a remote, isolated area right from the start? Why choose a brightly lit store sitting on a main road?
The terrifying aspect of that choice is the sheer cold rationality behind it. Convenience stores offered a perfect, predictable matrix of vulnerabilities for a predator. First, they featured lone employees, almost always women, working late-night graveyard shifts.
Right.
Second, they offered immediate, predictable cash reserves from the registers, which satisfied his constant need for drug money.
So it's a dual motive crime. He gets the funds for the meth, and he secures the victim for the violent fantasy.
And crucially, in a region like eastern Idaho, these specific convenience stores often provided immediate access to dark, rural escape routes. The highway systems and county roads meant he could strike the store, secure the funds, abduct the victim, and vanish into the absolute darkness of the high desert in a matter of minutes.
That terrifying calculation sets the stage for the actual breaking point, the first strike. The murder of Stacy Dawn Baldwin, which marks the official beginning of the spree on the night of February 27th, bleeding into the early hours of February 28, 1987.
Let us examine the victimology of this first case. Stacy Dawn Baldwin was 21 years old. She was a recently married young woman who had just started working the graveyard shift at a convenience store known as the Red Mini Barn, located at 222 South 550 West in Blackfoot.
The chronology provided in the forensic dossier gives us a very precise timeline of how this night unfolded. Stacy arrives for her shift at 9:45 p.m. She's working alongside a coworker named Stephanie Cooper. At 11 p.m., Cooper finishes her shift, clocks out, and leaves the premises. From that moment onward, Stacy is completely alone in the store.
And the abduction sequence is initiated a little over an hour later at approximately 12:15 a.m.
3 teenage girls are walking up to the Red Mini Barn to rent videos. One of the witnesses is a 17-year-old girl named Carrie Bayer. As the teenagers approach the brightly lit front of the store, they observe a man hurrying out of the front doors.
He quickly jumps into a distinctive pickup truck, a vehicle that investigators would later identify as a snowplow truck utilized by the Rhoades family for their seasonal plowing business. He drives away from the scene recklessly.
And Carrie Bayer notes a crucial, chilling detail as the truck speeds away. She sees an unidentified passenger sitting in the cab of the truck with him.
When the 3 teenage girls enter the convenience store, the scene immediately signals a severe crisis. The cash register has been left open, and investigators later determined that $249 are missing.
But it's the personal items that tell the real story here. Stacy's winter coat is still hanging on the rack in the back, and her car is still parked outside in the freezing late winter night. I mean, in sub-freezing Idaho temperatures, nobody voluntarily leaves a building without their coat and their vehicle.
Exactly. The details of the subsequent events are incredibly dark, but a clinical examination of them is necessary to understand the rapid escalation of this offender. According to his own later jailhouse confessions and the physical evidence, Rhoades drove Stacy Baldwin to a remote, desolate access road leading to an archery range.
About 5 miles northwest of Blackfoot, right?
Yes. He takes her out into the total isolation of the snow-covered landscape. His stated initial intent was to commit a sexual assault.
But the reality of the situation derailed his violent fantasy. He claimed that Baldwin became hysterical and began screaming in terror, which thwarted his ability to complete the assault.
And faced with a victim who is fighting back and screaming, he doesn't panic and flee. He doesn't just abandon her there in the dark. Instead, he shifts his methodology into an exertion of total cruel dominance.
I mean, it's just so dark. He orders this terrified 21-year-old woman to pray. He forces her down into the sub-freezing snow. As she desperately scrambles away from him on all fours through the deep snow, he draws a .38 caliber revolver. He shoots her.
Yeah.
The ballistics indicate he struck her once in the elbow and then fired twice more into her back.
He leaves her bleeding in the snow near some garbage dumpsters in lethal freezing temperatures. The medical reality of this event is perhaps the most difficult aspect to process. A forensic pathologist later concluded that Stacy did not die instantly from the gunshot wounds.
Oh, God.
She bled out slowly in the snow, surviving for over an hour in those agonizing conditions before finally succumbing to hemorrhagic shock and hypothermia.
It is impossible to fully comprehend the terror of that hour. But what makes it even more disturbing is establishing where Paul Ezra Rhoades was and what he was doing while she was slowly dying alone in the snow.
Between 1:30 and 2 a.m., roughly 90 minutes after he initiated the abduction at the mini barn, Rhoades is observed sitting inside Stan's Bar and Restaurant, an establishment located right near the convenience store.
Right.
He is calmly sitting at a table, drinking a cup of coffee with an unidentified male associate.
The psychological disconnect there is staggering. Grabbing a cup of coffee and casually chatting, knowing exactly what is happening to the woman you just shot a few miles away.
While he is sitting at the diner, a waitress specifically notices construction dust coating his clothing. That trace detail is a vital forensic link back to his daily life as a drywaller and sheetrocker, grounding the reality of this crime in his mundane day job.
Let's break down the psychology of that diner visit. I mean, how can a human mind compartmentalize extreme violence to that degree?
It speaks directly to the power-assertive dynamic of his criminological profile.
Wait, let's define that term for the listener. When behavioral analysts categorize someone as a power-assertive offender, what exactly are we looking at in terms of their psychological drive? How is that different from an offender who just lashes out in random, uncontrolled anger?
Well, a purely anger-driven offender is usually reacting to a specific trigger and loses control. A power-assertive offender uses extreme violence as an instrument to restore their own warped sense of masculinity, control, and self-worth.
Okay.
So for Rhoades, the exertion of total dominance, forcing Stacy to prey, hunting her as she crawled through the snow, it served to compensate for his lifelong, deep-seated feelings of inadequacy. It was a violent rebuttal to his physical limitations and the societal rejection he endured since childhood.
So the violence isn't a loss of control, it's an acquisition of control.
Precisely. Once he asserted that ultimate godlike power over another human's life and death, he felt internally stabilized. The coffee shop visit afterward isn't just callousness. It is the psychological afterglow of a man who feels he has finally conquered and taken control of his world, however twisted and lethal that control is.
Following the horror at the archery range, the timeline shows a chilling 19-day hiatus. The community is entirely on edge. A young woman has been murdered. The killer is unknown, and everyone is looking over their shoulder.
Yeah, the tension was massive.
Then, on St. Patrick's Day, March 17th, he strikes again. But this time, the pattern slightly shifts, revealing a massive escalation in his willingness to deploy clinical violence. This brings us to the execution of Nolan Haddon.
Let us look at the background of the second victim. Nolan Haddon was 20 years old. He was a vocational technical student who worked part-time as a clerk at Buck's convenience store located on First Street in Idaho Falls. His mother, Julie, described him to investigators as a remarkably easygoing young man who spent his free time hunting and fishing.
But Nolan fundamentally did not fit the target profile. Rhoades had spent months meticulously establishing during his voyeur phase. He wasn't a female service worker, so why did Rhoades target him?
The forensic and behavioral analysis heavily suggests this was a tragic mistake based on visual misidentification. Nolan Haddon had long, blonde, curly hair that reached down past his collar.
I see.
Investigators theorized that Rhoades was observing Buck's convenience store from a distance or peering through a window exactly as he had practiced during his dry runs and simply mistook Nolan for a young woman.
Rhoades enters the store, initiates the robbery, takes the cash from the register, and forces Nolan into the back walk-in cooler. But there is a massive question here regarding his motive. If his entire violent fantasy, his primary drive, was centered on dominating and assaulting women, why follow through with such a clinical, brutal murder once he gets into the brightly lit cooler and clearly realizes Nolan is a man?
If we look at the neurobiology and behavioral patterns of spree killers, the mechanics of the escalation become clear. Once the predatory sequence is initiated, once the offender crosses the threshold of the door with the weapon drawn and the robbery is in motion, the adrenaline spikes massively. The commitment to the act is locked in.
Right.
The psychological need for total control completely overrides the original parameters of the fantasy.
He cannot simply apologize for the mistake and walk away. The engine is already running too hot.
Exactly. The total disregard for a compliant victim shows how rapidly and aggressively Rhoades' violent threshold had expanded in just 19 days. He didn't attempt to abduct him or move him to a secondary location. Using the exact same .38 caliber revolver from the Baldwin murder, Rhoades shot Nolan Haddon 5 times at close range inside the confines of that walk-in cooler.
And tragically, mirroring Stacey Baldwin's fate, Nolan did not die immediately from the volley of gunfire. He was left bleeding on the floor of the freezing cooler, surviving briefly before ultimately succumbing to massive internal injuries and hemorrhagic shock.
It is a clinical execution. There's no lingering dominance display and no forcing the victim to prey. Just absolute, immediate, lethal force utilized simply because his initial fantasy was interrupted by reality, and he needed to eliminate the witness to maintain his control.
This incident proves that the violence itself was becoming the primary addiction. The specific gender of the victim, while initially the catalyst for the hunt, became secondary to the sheer act of killing once the sequence was set in motion.
Which logically sets the stage for the absolute climax of his cruelty. Just 2 days after the murder of Nolan Haddon, on March 19, 1987, the spree reaches its terrifying zenith. This is the final, most protracted and depraved act detailed in the dossier, the abduction of Susan Michelbacker.
Susan Michelbacker was 34 years old. She was an established, highly respected professional in the community, working as a dedicated special education teacher at Eagle Rock Junior High.
On the morning of March 19th, the timeline indicates she was not feeling well. Her intention was simply to drive to the school, drop off her prepared lesson plans for a substitute teacher, and immediately return home to rest.
She drives to Eagle Rock Junior High in her 1984 Ford Econoline van at 6:30 in the morning. She successfully drops off the lesson plans. Then at approximately 7 a.m., she makes a brief stop at an Albertsons grocery store located in East Idaho Falls.
Right.
During this quick errand, she leaves her van unlocked in the parking lot. And that is the exact moment Paul Ezra Rhoades slips inside and waits for her to return.
What follows is an incredibly high-risk, brazen daylight abduction that speaks to the absolute zenith of his methamphetamine psychosis and his perceived invulnerability. Rhoades holds her captive inside her own van and orchestrates a highly visible bank run.
Witnesses actually begin spotting the van moving through morning traffic. At 7:30 a.m., a witness observes the Econoline van nearly collide with another vehicle at an intersection. This witness clearly identifies Rhoades sitting in the passenger seat, exerting control over the situation.
An hour later, at 8:30 a.m., Susan is forced to pull into the drive-in window of a First Interstate bank branch. Under the threat of the .38 revolver, she cashes a check for $1,000.
And the brazenness of it is staggering. I mean, just 10 minutes later, at 8:40 a.m., he forces her to drive to a second, entirely different branch of the First Interstate Bank and cash another check for an additional $1,000.
Moving a captive victim through multiple public banking transactions in broad daylight, surrounded by other commuters and bank tellers, underscores how completely detached from reality he'd become. The success of his previous 2 murders had imbued him with a terrifying sense of omnipotence.
At 10 a.m., a witness named Susan Browning observes the Econoline van turning into her driveway. This driveway is located near a vast, remote expanse of lava fields about 8 miles west of Idaho Falls.
Right, it's very rugged out there.
This terrain is incredibly rough, yeah. Similar to the craters of the Moon area, jagged basalt, deep fissures, and thick sagebrush. And crucially, Browning notes that Rhoades is now the one driving the van. He's taken complete physical and vehicular control.
He drives her deep into the absolute seclusion of the lava rock. And it is here, hidden by the geography, that the violence reaches its absolute nadir.
I want to acknowledge to the listener that the clinical details we are about to discuss are incredibly dark and uncensored. But understanding the depths of his rage and the specific, methodical ways he chose to destroy his victims is vital to understanding the full forensic picture of this spree.
Out in the isolation of that lava field, Susan Michelbacker was subjected to a prolonged, deeply sadistic physical and sexual assault. The forensic evidence recovered later definitively proves she was raped and subjected to what the formal legal documents grimly refer to as infamous crimes against nature.
The actual execution was a textbook, clinical example of overkill. She was shot a total of 9 times. And the forensics allow investigators to paint a horrifyingly precise picture of the sequence of the gunfire.
The initial shots were fired while Susan was standing up, actively fighting and struggling against him among the jagged rocks. The impacts force her to the ground. Rhoades then stands directly over her and continues firing downward into her body.
He keeps pulling the trigger until the revolver clicks empty. He has fired all 6 rounds. But the violence doesn't stop.
No, it doesn't. He pauses. He physically ejects the spent casings, retrieves fresh ammunition, and reloads the .38 caliber revolver. He then approaches her, turns her body over, and fires a final lethal shot directly into the center of her chest at point-blank range.
And the depravity of the event does not end with her death. The medical examiner's evidence proved a horrific post-mortem desecration. The physical findings show that he ejaculated into her mouth either in the exact moment she was dying or shortly after she had already passed.
It's just horrific.
He abandoned her brutalized body deep in the lava field, where she was eventually discovered 2 days later on March 21st.
If we analyze this specific crime through the lens of victimology, the escalation is profound and highly symbolic. He initially targeted service workers, young women working vulnerable, low-wage night shifts. But Susan Michelbacher was an established professional. She was a special education teacher. In a rural community, she represented social order, caregiving, and moral stability.
She was a pillar of the exact community that he felt entirely alienated from.
Exactly. Degrading a special education teacher, subjecting her to those specific humiliating crimes, the massive overkill of reloading the weapon, and the ultimate sexual desecration of her body, it wasn't just a murder. It was the ultimate physical expression of his rage against a society that he felt had rejected, mocked, and discarded him since he was a disabled 4-year-old boy. He wasn't just killing Susan Michelbacher. He was attempting to annihilate a symbol of societal normalcy and authority.
He has left a trail of immense, unimaginable devastation. 3 lives taken, 3 families destroyed, and an entire region paralyzed by fear. But leaving a trail of extreme, explosive overkill creates a massive problem for an offender. You cannot contain the physical evidence.
No, you can't.
The adrenaline of the spree crashes, the methamphetamine psychosis breaks, and the forensic reality of what he has done is waiting for him.
Following the extreme violence of the Michelbacher murder, Rhoades' behavior degrades from calculated predation into pure, impulsive chaos. He steals his mother's green Ford LTD and flees Idaho, heading south toward the Nevada border.
On March 24th, just days after Susan's body is pulled from the lava fields, he completely loses control of the vehicle and wrecks the Ford LTD in the median of a highway near the town of Wells, Nevada.
Right.
Passing motorists witness the crash. They see him climb out of the wreckage, visibly fumbling with an object near the driver's side door before he abandons the vehicle entirely and just starts walking aimlessly toward the town.
The Nevada Highway Patrol is dispatched to the crash site. Upon inspecting the abandoned vehicle, they find a .38 caliber revolver lying in the dirt near the driver's door. Approximately 45 feet away, they recover a holster.
Local law enforcement tracks his path from the highway into town. They locate him easily. He is found sitting inside the four-way casino in Wells. And the physical and psychological state they find him in is bizarre. He's barefoot, completely lethargic, and just sitting at a table playing blackjack.
When officers approach him, he offers absolutely no physical resistance. The adrenaline engine that fueled the 3-week spree has completely seized up. The peak of the methamphetamine psychosis has crashed into severe dopamine depletion. He is utterly exhausted, both physically and neurologically.
An officer placing him under arrest makes a passing, somewhat rhetorical remark to him, saying something to the effect of, "If we had arrested you earlier, we might have saved a life." And Rhoades just looks at the officer with dead eyes and replies, "I did it."
That lethargy, that immediate capitulation, is the hallmark of the post-offense crash in substance-driven spree killers. And with his physical apprehension, law enforcement can finally begin assembling the massive forensic matrix that will legally secure his fate.
Let's walk through the mechanics of that forensic evidence, because it's like he was walking through these crime scenes covered in invisible ink. In his meth-induced psychosis, he felt completely untraceable, like a ghost. But modern forensics acted like a blacklight. Every step he took left a physical tether behind him.
The forensic connectivity in this case is a phenomenal example of the early, rigorous integration of different scientific disciplines. We have to start with the ballistics.
How do they conclusively link that specific gun found in the Nevada dirt to 3 different crime scenes hundreds of miles away?
It relies on the microscopic mechanics of the firearm. When a bullet travels down the barrel of a gun, the spiral grooves machined into the metal to make the bullet spin leaves microscopic striations and scratches on the sides of the bullet.
Like a signature.
Exactly. These striations are entirely unique to that specific barrel, much like a human fingerprint. Forensic ballistics experts test-fired the .38 revolver recovered in Nevada and compared the striations on the test bullets to the slugs recovered from the bodies of Stacey Baldwin, Nolan Haddon, and Susan Michelbacher under a comparison microscope. It was a conclusive, undeniable match. One weapon was scientifically tied to all three scenes.
Then you have the impression evidence. We talked about the heavy snow at the Red Mini Barn and the archery range where Stacey Baldwin was murdered. Investigators didn't just photograph the boot prints, they physically cast them. How do you preserve a footprint in freezing snow without destroying it?
It requires extreme precision. Crime scene technicians use a substance like dental stone, mixing it with very cold water, or they use an aerosol wax to lightly freeze and reinforce the fragile details of the snow print before pouring the casting material.
Oh, that makes sense.
The resulting three-dimensional casts from the archery range were analyzed. The size, the wear patterns, and the specific tread design were perfectly consistent with the heavy boots Rhoades was wearing at the exact moment of his arrest in the casino.
Beyond the ballistics and the boots, trace evidence played a massive role in building the net around him, specifically microscopic hair analysis.
Keep in mind, this is 1987. Widespread, rapid DNA profiling is not yet the standard investigative tool it is today. They relied on microscopic hair comparison. Trace evidence technicians look at the microscopic structure of the hair, the cuticle, the cortex, and the medulla pattern.
Right.
Hairs recovered from Stacey Baldwin's blouse and hairs found scattered inside Susan Mucklebacker's van were analyzed against known samples taken from Rhoades. The morphological characteristics were a match, physically placing him in direct, intimate contact with the victims and their vehicles.
And the biological evidence, the serology, was absolutely devastating to any claim of innocence.
The semen recovered during the autopsy from Susan Mitchell-Backer's oral cavity was analyzed for blood typing and secretor status. The results concluded that Paul Ezra Rhoades could not be excluded as the donor, directly tying him to the horrific sexual assault and desecration in the lava fields.
Finally, there was the physical possession of property. When Nevada law enforcement frisked him at the casino, they found a small, inexpensive watch in his pocket. It was positively identified by family members as the exact watch Stacey Baldwin was wearing on the night she was abducted.
He kept a trophy, a physical token to remind him of the absolute power he exerted at the archery range.
So the state has built an absolute mountain of physical evidence: ballistics, footprints, hair, biology, and the victim's property. The defense team looks at this and realizes they cannot possibly argue that he didn't commit the acts. The physical reality is undeniable. So they pivot their entire strategy to a massive, complex legal conflict: the insanity defense.
This strategy initiates a critical, highly controversial moment in Idaho's legal history. In January 1988, Rhoades' defense team mounts a vigorous challenge against the state. Idaho had recently taken the aggressive legislative step of abolishing the traditional insanity defense, such as the Imnaten rule, which determines if a defendant knew right from wrong.
So you can't just plead not guilty by reason of insanity in Idaho and let a jury decide.
Not anymore under the new law. The defense argued to the state Supreme Court that this legislative change was fundamentally unconstitutional. Their argument centered on the legal concept of mens rea, the guilty mind. They contended that Rhoades' chronic, severe methamphetamine psychosis, compounded by a lifetime of severe organic brain trauma and abuse, meant he was biologically and psychologically incapable of forming the specific criminal intent required for capital murder.
Got it.
He was, in their framing, merely a passenger in a body driven by chemical psychosis.
They're essentially arguing the difference between someone who gets voluntarily intoxicated and does something stupid, versus someone whose brain architecture has been so fundamentally altered by trauma and prolonged chemical abuse that they literally do not possess the cognitive hardware to form intent.
Precisely. However, the Idaho court system flatly rejects this argument. They rule that the legislative change abolishing the insanity defense is constitutional. They determine that while Rhoades may be mentally ill and addicted, he is legally competent to stand trial and understand the proceedings against him.
He is tried separately for the Baldwin and Mitchell-Bacher murders. And if the judge, the jury, or the public had any lingering doubts about his ongoing explosive volatility and his inherently violent nature, Rhoades puts it on full, terrifying display right in the middle of the courtroom proceedings.
On March 24, 1988, exactly 1 year to the day after his arrest in Nevada, he is seated in court to hear the formal sentencing for the abduction and murder of Susan Mitchell-Bacher. When the judge officially hands down the death sentence, the fragile psychological containment Rhoades has maintained shatters completely.
He physically explodes. Surrounded by armed bailiffs and law enforcement, he literally picks up his heavy wooden courtroom chair and hurls it directly at the lead prosecutor. It requires multiple officers rushing him to physically wrestle him to the ground and restrain him.
This outburst completely validates the underlying power-assertive behavioral diagnosis. The moment his power is definitively legally stripped away by the authority of the court, the benign mask vanishes instantly, and the core, unadulterated rage that drove the spree erupts in physical violence.
Ultimately, the weight of the justice system comes down on him with absolute finality. He receives a sentence of death for the kidnapping and murder of Susan Michelbacher. He receives a second, separate death sentence for the kidnapping and murder of Stacey Dawn Baldwin. And, following a conditional guilty plea to avoid a third trial, he receives a sentence of life without the possibility of parole for the murder of Nolan Haddon.
Which transitions his narrative into its final, highly protracted chapter. The 23 years he would spend living on death row in the maximum security unit of the Idaho Maximum Security Institution.
From his sentencing in 1988 until the day of his execution on November 18, 2011, Rhoades and his legal team utilized the appellate process exhaustively. He filed numerous appeals, challenging various aspects of his conviction and sentencing, pushing the legal battles all the way up to the United States Supreme Court.
The crux of his final desperate appeals in 2011 focused heavily on the physical mechanics of his impending death. He legally challenged the ethics and the constitutionality of Idaho's lethal injection protocols. His legal team argued that the newly proposed specific cocktail of drugs would cause him to experience excruciating physical pain during the execution process,
which carries a deeply profound, almost sickening irony. The man who forced Stacey Baldwin to bleed out in the freezing snow for over an hour, who shot Nolan Haddon and left him to die on the floor of a walk-in cooler, and who orchestrated the sadistic, protracted torture and overkill of Susan Michelbacher among the jagged lava rocks, was now arguing that the state must ensure his own death was entirely painless and comfortable.
The appellate courts ultimately denied these final 11th-hour appeals, clearing the path for the sentence to be carried out. And that brings us directly into the stark clinical environment of the execution chamber.
The details of his final moments, strapped to the lethal injection gurney, provide a masterclass in the psychology of terminal manipulation.
He is secured to the table. The intravenous lines are inserted. The families of his victims are seated in the witness area watching him through the glass. And given the opportunity for a final statement, he offers an incredibly complex, calculated partial admission. He turns his head, looks directly at the husband of Susan Michelbacher, the woman he so thoroughly degraded and overkilled, and he apologizes to him.
Right.
He says the words, "I did it." He grants that specific family the closure of a full admission.
But then, in his very last conscious act on this earth, he turns his gaze to the families of Stacey Baldwin and Nolan Haddon, and he tells them, through the glass, that they still have to keep looking.
He intentionally, maliciously denies them the truth of his guilt.
The ballistics matched the gun in his hand to the bullets in their bodies. The physical boot prints matched. The hair matched. The legal system proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that he killed them. But he weaponizes his dying breath to plant a seed of agonizing, impossible doubt in the minds of grieving parents.
Yeah.
Julie Haddon, Nolan's mother, was sitting right there watching him die. She later stated that while she felt a profound sense of justice that the execution was finally happening, she was completely stunned by his final, cruel refusal to admit his role in her son's death. Why? For a predator who has lost all physical agency, who is seconds away from a chemically induced death, why give closure to one family but intentionally go out of your way to deny it to the others?
You have to view it through the lens of a predator stripped of all other weaponry. On that lethal injection table, Paul Ezra Rhoades possessed zero physical power. He could not abduct, he could not strike, he could not throw a chair. His only remaining asset, the final weapon in his arsenal, was information. Silence and the deliberate withholding of truth became his final act of violence.
Wow.
By intentionally denying the Baldwin and Haddon families the admission they had waited 24 years to hear, he retained a psychological dominance over them. He ensured that his voice, his manipulative lie, would echo in their minds long after his heart stopped. Even as the lethal drugs flowed into his veins, he was exerting power.
It is a profoundly chilling end to a horrifying life. When I step back and evaluate this entire forensic dossier, what stays with me is the fragility of safety. How those 3 freezing weeks in 1987 permanently altered the psychological DNA of eastern Idaho. The mundane innocence of a late-night video rental or a teacher dropping off lesson plans in the early morning light, all of it was irrevocably tainted. Routine errands transformed into potential peril because of the cascading trauma and escalating rage of one man.
And from a broader criminological standpoint, the lessons embedded in this case remain highly critical today. It serves as a grim, undeniable case study on the destructive power of severe methamphetamine addiction, illustrating exactly how the drug acts as a neurological accelerant for violence, particularly in rural communities with limited resources.
Absolutely.
Furthermore, it highlights the absolute indispensable importance of early forensic integration. It demonstrates how ballistics, trace hair analysis, impression casting, and behavioral profiling must all work in seamless tandem to build a net around an offender who is rapidly escalating their violence.
It is incredibly heavy material, but vital to dissect and understand. Which leaves me with a final thought I want you, the listener, to mull over as we conclude this analysis. Think deeply about the concept of closure within the justice system.
Yeah.
We so often operate under the assumption that an execution, the ultimate finality of the law, automatically balances the cosmic scales and delivers peace to the survivors. But when an offender uses their dying breath to plant a deliberate, cruel seed of doubt, exactly as Rhoades did to the Baldwin and Haddon families, it forces us to ask a really difficult philosophical question. Does true closure actually come from the rigid structure of the legal system? Or is closure something victims' families have to somehow construct for themselves, building it piece by piece entirely on their own in the face of a killer's final manipulative lie?
It is a profound question, and one that challenges our most basic comforting assumptions about how justice actually functions in the real world.
It really does. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us today. It is not an easy subject matter to process, but navigating these dark, terrifying behavioral waters helps us understand the true architectural realities of the world we live in. We will see you next time.